So I'm John Holmes. I'm a reader in alcohol policy in the University of Sheffield's Alcohol Research Group in the UK. And we've done a lot of work looking at the effects of alcohol policies and particularly alcohol pricing policies. There's lots of evidence from different places and at different time points on the impact of alcohol price increases on alcohol consumption and also the harm alcohol causes. And that consistently shows that if you increase the price of alcohol, it's followed by reductions in consumption and reductions in the deaths, the hospital admissions and the crimes and other harms that alcohol causes. The evidence is quite clear that when you increase alcohol prices, drinkers do respond. They reduce their consumption, and that could include reducing consumption of all different beverage types, so beer, wine, spirits, but also changing their patterns of drinking. So we see when prices go up that binge drinking tends to go down as well. And that evidence seems to be true for all different kinds of drinkers, so for younger drinkers, older drinkers, lighter drinkers, heavier drinkers. Obviously different people respond to different degrees, but it seems that all different kinds of drinkers do respond to alcohol price increases. The biggest problems with cheap alcohol are that it tends to be purchased by the very heaviest drinkers and also by the drinkers on lower incomes. Not necessarily moderate drinkers on lower incomes, but heavier drinkers on lower incomes particularly focus on cheaper alcohol. And that means that cheap alcohol is associated with a big chunk of the harm that's caused. And there are particular kinds of cheap alcohol that are problematic. In the UK, the very cheapest alcohol is very strong white, what we call white ciders, but also big multi-packs of beer and budget brand spirits. In Australia, you have some of the same kinds of products, but of course you also have cask wine as well, which is sold at very low prices and is associated with lots of alcohol-related problems. So minimum pricing very simply sets a floor price below which a unit or a standard drink of alcohol cannot be sold to consumers. What that means in practice is if you set a minimum unit price of, say, $1 or $1.20, a standard drink can't be sold below that price. So if a pint of beer contains around 2 standard drinks, that would mean, and the minimum unit price was $1, that would mean you couldn't sell a pint of beer for less than $2. The effects of minimum pricing are proportionate to the amount of alcohol you buy below the minimum price. The people who buy the most alcohol below minimum price are heavy drinkers, and particularly heavy drinkers on lower incomes, the people who suffer most harm from their drinking. On the other hand, the people who are least affected are moderate drinkers, and that's moderate drinkers irrespective of their income. Even moderate drinkers who are quite poor buy very little cheap alcohol. They simply aren't buying the products that are affected by the policy, which means they will only be affected to a very small degree. So the evidence we've got from looking at the potential impact of minimum pricing in the UK is that as well as reducing health problems and reducing consumption, it would also reduce levels of alcohol-related crime, levels of absences in the workplace, which of course places a big burden on both employers and on other employees who are having to cover for those people. And more generally, at a population level, it has a big impact on the cost to the health service imposed by alcohol, and also the cost to other public services such as the police, the ambulance service, the court system, and so on. So it's got a big overall impact on the cost of alcohol to society. There are big inequalities in who is affected by alcohol and the harms alcohol causes. People on lower incomes have much higher rates of alcohol-related mortality, alcohol-related hospital admissions than people on higher incomes. Minimum pricing, because it targets those groups who are at greatest risk of harm, it reduces those inequalities. And it does that to a much bigger degree than other pricing policies. So whereas a tax increase is an effective way of reducing alcohol-related harm, and we shouldn't rule that out as a policy option, introducing a minimum price is a much better way of reducing inequalities and the unfairnesses in who's affected by alcohol problems. So it's really important to recognise that minimum pricing is a policy that targets heavy drinking in the general population. Of course, there are a small group of people who are dependent on alcohol, but they're only a relatively small proportion, perhaps as little as a fifth, of the heavy drinkers in the population. And if we want to help those people, yes, minimum pricing may help, but that we can do more by improving the treatment system, providing specialist help for people who have problems with addiction and dependence. We need to be very careful about how we talk about the potential impact of minimum pricing on dependent drinkers. We shouldn't expect them all to respond in one way. There may be positive impacts, but we should also be aware that there could be some problematic responses to policy as well. The other thing to say about the impact of minimum pricing on people who are dependent on alcohol is people don't end up dependent for no reason. They've developed dependence problems for lots of reasons, and one of those things that facilitates that is the availability of cheap alcohol, which makes it easier to escalate your drinking over time and end up drinking very large amounts with all the problems that brings. Minimum pricing can help to prevent that kind of slide into dependence by making the cheap alcohol less available, and perhaps we can hope that there will be a smaller dependent population in future, even if the impact of the policy on that group isn't as strong as it is on some other populations. The other part of the story, of course, is the harms to people other than the drinker that are very direct rather than simply the financial costs to health services. Those include alcohol-related crime against people who haven't been drinking, drink driving, which we know about for a long time now, and also things like impacts on children's experiences while they're growing up, problems with their parents drinking. There's a big debate in the UK at the moment about the damaging experiences of children growing up in a household where there's a person who's dependent on alcohol. Again, minimum pricing can try and help with all of these different problems by, again, reducing people's consumption, particularly consumption among the heaviest drinkers who are probably causing the greatest amount of this harm to people other than the drinker. We tend to talk a lot when we talk about tackling alcohol problems, about the problems faced by drinkers themselves, their risk of death, their risk of suffering illnesses and injuries. What we talk about perhaps less is the cost it imposes on the rest of society. So alcohol places a huge burden on health services, both in terms of treating chronic diseases, but also in terms of the burden it places on accident and emergencies or emergency departments. People turning up with injuries, the kind of chaos you see on some Friday nights. In the UK, there's lots of problems with people turning up at accident and emergency departments drunk and then being violent towards staff members or even ambulances that are picking them up in the first place. Minimum pricing could help to tackle those kinds of problems because it's reducing the consumption and reducing the need for people to have treatment in the first place. Until 2018, no country in the world had introduced a minimum unit price for the whole alcohol market. That changed on the 1st of May when Scotland introduced a minimum unit price of 50 pence per unit of alcohol. Since then, both Wales and Ireland have passed legislation to introduce the same kind of policy, although we're waiting to see what level of minimum price they'll introduce. Ireland is going for €1 per unit. We're not sure what Wales is going for at this point. The other place that's tried minimum pricing policies is Canada, but there's a difference between minimum unit pricing and the policies that Canada has. Minimum unit pricing increases the minimum price in direct proportion to the amount of alcohol in the drink. In Canada, they don't do that. They just have the same minimum price, irrespective of the alcohol content, although exactly how that works differs between the different Canadian provinces. What we've seen from minimum pricing in Canada, though, is that when those minimum prices go up, consumption falls, the harm caused by alcohol in terms of deaths and hospital admissions falls. The evidence is very clear that minimum pricing appears to be an effective and well-targeted way of reducing alcohol-related harm. So any government that is interested in doing so should be looking at the policy, and particularly if it's interested in reducing health inequalities as well.